Thanks so much to everyone for attending this virtual presentation and for your interest in the digital readiness community of practice. As we get started, I want to share this land acknowledgement. As a settler, someone who is not Indigenous or native to this place, I would like to acknowledge that each of us in Wisconsin is occupying ancestral land that belongs to one or more of the 12 First Nations of Wisconsin. I'm located in Madison, Wisconsin, which is the ancestral home of the Ho-Chunk, a place their nation has called DiGPres since time immemorial. We are grateful to the Ho-Chunk Nation for their stewardship of DiGPres, and we respect the inherent sovereignty of the 12 First Nations of Wisconsin. As we live and work and hone our practice with our communities, we encourage each of you that are settlers or not Indigenous to explore and learn about the communities and Native nations who lived, still live, and steward the land on which you live and work. So here's the journey we're taking you on today. We're going to tell you a little bit about ourselves, what this project is and where it came from. We're going to talk to a couple of practitioners who have benefited from this work, and then we will leave some time for live Q&A at the end. So it's nice to meet you, virtual audience. I'm Kristen Whitson. I'm a digital project specialist with Recollection Wisconsin. My colleague Kristen Leffelman at the Wisconsin Historical Society and I were two of the coordinators of this Digital Readiness Community of Practice initiative. Jennifer Gurske from the Madison Trust for Historic Preservation was a member of our launch committee for this project, and as well as incorporating some of these principles into her own organization's work. And then Dustin Mack, the curator at the History Museum at the Castle in Appleton, Wisconsin, has used many of these digital readiness concepts in an affiliated project, the Community Archiving Workshop, to gear AV training resources for non-professionals. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, Recollection Wisconsin is the DPLA hub in the state of Wisconsin. So that means that it serves as a pathway or pipeline for Wisconsin libraries, archives, and museums to contribute their unique collections to DPLA, or the Digital Public Library of America. Recollection Wisconsin harvests metadata from over 200 cultural heritage organizations around the state. Many of those content partners are small, local historical organizations, and over the years, we've heard from many of them that they would love to share their materials in Recollection Wisconsin and the DPLA, but they don't have the time, resources, or expertise to digitize their materials in the first place. So that's why Recollection Wisconsin has increasingly offered digitization resources and toolkits to assist our content partners in their digital projects. Recollection Wisconsin is supported by several governing partners in the state, including the Wisconsin Historical Society. Recollection Wisconsin and the Wisconsin Historical Society work closely together on many cultural heritage initiatives, which Kristen Leffelman will tell you a little bit about right now.
Thanks, Kristen. So as Kristen Whitson said earlier, I'm Kristen Leffelman, and I'm the Southeast Outreach Coordinator for the Wisconsin Historical Society. And I'm going to share a bit about how the Society, Wisconsin Library Services, and Recollection Wisconsin first partnered on this project and began the planning process. So I am part of the Society's Local History Outreach Program. And so we manage outreach services and partnerships with local history, heritage, and cultural groups. We have programs that include our Speakers Bureau, traveling exhibits, webinars, conferences, historical markers, and more. But most importantly for this conversation, we manage our local history affiliate program. Next slide, please. So our local history affiliate program was the first local history affiliate program in the nation. It was established by state statute back in 1898. And currently the program supports a network of 426 affiliated organizations statewide. The program is open to all nonprofit community history and cultural organizations, And that does include publicly funded museums and tribal museums. And our affiliates receive a number of benefits, but I think most important to most affiliates are support from our local history outreach staff and access to the rest of the affiliate network. Next slide. To really understand the foundations of our project with WiLS and Recollection Wisconsin, I think it's important to have a good sense of who our affiliates are. Our affiliates are required to send in an annual report each year. So in addition to the touch points and conversations that we have throughout the year, we get a lot of information from those reports. Our affiliates range in size from municipal to the state level, and they include cultural groups and small museums and archives. And 75% of those organizations are all volunteer organizations with budgets under $50,000. Most of the rest have fewer than 5 paid employees. So we are talking about very small organizations here. And outside of our county historical societies and some of the larger or statewide museums, it is unusual to see professionally trained historians, curators, or archivists staffing our affiliates. So we do need to keep that in mind as we work with these organizations. Next slide. So based on what we know about our affiliates and what WiLS and Recollection Wisconsin have encountered through their years of consultation and education, we identified this challenge. Local history organizations have high quality and unique collections, but they're inaccessible to most of the public outside of the immediate area. So we asked, how can we meet local history organizations where they are to help them create digital collections and make them more accessible? Next slide. And the solution we came up with was this. We would combine WiLS and Recollection Wisconsin's digitization expertise with the Society's affiliate network to most effectively reach the smallest and most underrepresented organizations. All right, next. So as we were beginning our discussions, we identified the following challenges based on all of our past work with these groups. So we know that these groups may be invested in collections management practices that are not well aligned with contemporary standards and best practices for digital collection creation and access. Many of them rely on volunteer labor with high turnover, inconsistent training, and minimal documentation of workflows. And yet at the same time, they're asked by stakeholders to digitize historical records, often before basic intellectual control over physical collections has been established. And here I do want to clarify that we don't necessarily ask or expect our local history organizations to be professional archives with the very best of best practices. But we do want to meet these groups where they are to help them make any digital collections more accessible. So next slide. With that in mind, we decided to apply for a grant from the National Historical Publications and Records Commission with the goal of planning and seeding an archives collaborative that would empower these small, often rural, under-resourced and underrepresented cultural heritage institutions in Wisconsin to provide online access to their archives and historical records. Basically, we wanted to increase capacity for small repositories to create, manage, and share digital records. Next slide. So to achieve that, we basically set off on a fact-finding mission to gather information about local groups' digital collections development needs, goals, and gaps. And we did this through 3 main streams. First, we did a web-based survey of our affiliates to assess their current digital readiness status. We received 127 responses to that survey, which was about a 31% completion rate, which well exceeded our expectations. Next up, we did a series of 5 regional facilitated community conversations that were really meant to connect and share insights into groups' concerns and their aspirations regarding digitization. And then finally, we organized a series of 3 meetings with 15 select local history leaders. Those meetings were really meant to distill the findings from this survey and the community conversations into a strategic plan. Right, next slide. So through those touch points, we learned or confirmed that local organizations were already digitizing content, but usually or often without guidelines. They were digitizing content, but it wasn't available online. Or if it was most likely to be available only through the local group's website or Facebook page. And then likely because of that lack of accessibility, the primary users of the content were staff or volunteers. We also learned that organizations kind of preferred to turn to peer organizations for support to really see what like organizations were doing to succeed in their digital projects. And finally, these organizations were requesting guidance on best practices and standards, copyright, at-risk media formats, and funding support. Next slide. So with those lessons in mind, we began to think about our goals for an implementation grant. And those were to form a community of practice to start identifying those best practices and benchmarks for digital collection creation and management, to provide a roadmap for public history organizations undertaking digital projects. And that's really from start to finish and all sorts of points in between. And then ultimately to improve public access to and engagement with these digital community histories so local groups could better share their unique collections. So with that, I'm going to pass this back to Kristen Whitson to continue our story.
Thanks, Kristen. So that brings us up to the 2020 implementation grant from the NHPRC, building a digital readiness community of practice. That 2019 grant was planning for the community of practice. Now we're implementing building the digital readiness community of practice. So this year, we've had two key project goals and outcomes based on all of those community conversations. We want to help local historical organizations increase preservation of and access to historical materials through a set of systematic approaches and by providing resources to attain those goals. And then also to provide resources and support through a statewide community of practice where participants can share their best practices and experiences. So in other words, we wanted local history practitioners to be able to do the thing and connect with each other while they were doing the thing. So there are really two key concepts that provide the foundation and structure for this work: digital readiness and a community of practice. And you've heard us use those phrases a bunch of times already, and here's what we mean when we say them. So digital readiness, for our project, we define it as having the knowledge, tools, resources, and infrastructure to provide online public access to archives and historical records. And then a community of practice is a group of people who share a common concern, a set of problems, passion about a topic, and they deepen their knowledge and expertise in this area by interacting on an ongoing basis. Communities of practice are very common. You're surely a part of several, and they're usually informal and form pretty organically. So with those concepts in mind, all of the feedback we receive from local history practitioners, from our networks of colleagues, from our launch committee, here's what we did with all of that. So we created the Digital Readiness Levels, which we're going to show you in just a second, a roadmap to digital readiness. And these are loosely based on the NDSA levels of preservation with which many of you are probably familiar. We also created expanded a digital projects toolkit and implementation guide. We created a digital readiness glossary, a series of digital readiness case studies, and then we put together 4 digital readiness fairs over the last several months. So all of this is really the what and the how of the project. What Kristen and I have shared so far is the why, as in why is this important and needed. And these tools here are all the ways in which Recollection Wisconsin and really the NHPRC responded to those needs. So the digital readiness levels, which we're going to look at on the next slide. I just want to tell you that, as I said, they're based on the NDSA levels of preservation, but they have a slightly different focus and they're geared for a non-professional audience or a practitioner audience. These levels of digital readiness are intended to be a very accessible, non-consecutive way of assessing and progressing through a set of guidelines. So as you can see here, the levels are set up in 7 focus areas across 3 different tiers. An organization can start, end, or progress anywhere in these levels of digital readiness. These are intended to be a roadmap for where to start and where to go on various parts of a digital project. Emily Fotenhauer and Vicki Tobias of Recollection Wisconsin, who some of you may know, drafted this document after several rounds of soliciting and incorporating feedback from a network of digital projects and local history colleagues. So in keeping with that community of practice, community-driven model. You'll see that the functional areas here, focus areas, hew pretty closely to the actual experience of taking a project from beginning to end. And that's on purpose. These levels are meant to fit the real life, everyday experiences of cultural heritage practitioners in small and under-resourced historical organizations. The second page here, we have a whole check as you go section, which really emphasizes the recursive nature of this process. So you do a thing and you check to make sure it's working. You do another thing and you check to make sure that you documented that thing. We wanted to include these here because they're questions that cultural heritage and local history practitioners really find themselves asking and answering during the stages of their digital projects. So that's the digital readiness levels. Among the many pieces of feedback we've heard throughout the years was a strong desire to meet up with other practitioners to talk about these digital readiness basics. So many local history practitioners are web savvy and many are not. Even among those who are, we're at a point in digital archiving and digital projects where there is so much information available that it can be really overwhelming to sift through it all, especially for those who aren't at universities or large historical societies or don't even do this as a job. So the community of practice asked for a way to more directly connect to their peers and colleagues. We put together 4 digital readiness fairs over the course of several months this summer. They're all virtual. The fairs included time for connecting with each other. They had sessions on basics like digital materials, outreach, copyright sessions, basic scanning procedures, introductions to the Wisconsin Historical Society and to Recollection Wisconsin as an option for hosting or making available their content. Attendees were introduced to those digital readiness levels that you just saw and to the associated digital readiness tools, and were given the opportunity to sign up to join this community of practice. We had about 175 individuals attend the 4 different fairs from 120 different organizations from around Wisconsin and beyond Wisconsin state borders too. I think we've really found that these events were pretty key in building the community of practice among attendees, and we're excited to see what that means for the future of this community. So of the many helpful things that we have heard from our digital projects colleagues is that they needed both a place to start that didn't feel overwhelming and the specific tools to do the things that they wanted to do. And as I previously mentioned, so many organizations and institutions have generated digitization guides and manuals that it can be overwhelming and sometimes even discouraging to try to sort through them all. So we wanted to pull together from Recollection Wisconsin the best and most applicable of those resources to aid local history practitioners in their work. So we're working on a digital projects toolkit. We already have a digital readiness glossary. Among other feedback, we have heard that archives and digital collections jargon and acronyms can feel really off-putting and overwhelming to community members. So one way to address that is to define commonly used terms and acronyms in a pretty easily accessible way. Finally, we've also published a set of digital readiness case studies with local history organizations in Wisconsin. These are stories of cultural heritage organizations throughout the state who have undertaken various digital projects and have advice, lessons learned, and tips and tricks to share with the wider community. So this is another way we're responding to the request for real life practical advice from folks who have done the work. So now that you know what digital readiness is and how it's used in a community of practice, we'll hear from a couple of those community members. I'd like to pass it off to Jennifer Gurske.
Great, thanks, Kristen. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Gurske. I am the Program and Technology Manager at the Madison Trust for Historic Preservation. Next slide. This slide just gives some brief information as to our organization. That, like was mentioned before, we are one of the local affiliates with the Wisconsin Historical Society. I'm considered one of the smaller ones. I am the permanent part-time staff. We do have one temporary employee that is on a grant that will end this year. And so we celebrate and advocate for the preservation and restoration and use of historic places in Madison. So we're a little bit different than some of the other organizations in that we're not a museum. We still weren't quite sure what to do with our archives. We knew we had some valuable material and wanted to share that, but we weren't quite sure how to share that. Next slide. So Kristen mentioned the digital readiness levels. This slide shows where we are in the digital readiness levels currently. And that doesn't mean that we haven't gone forward and gone back. We have found that in this process that started in the summer of 2019, that we have set goals and prioritized, and maybe our situations changed. COVID came along, things like that. And we had to regroup and go back and look at again and figure out where we were and plan maybe a different route. So we do find the levels dynamic in how we work through our project. But this kind of gives you an idea of where we are now. We're kind of all over the place. Some things we've done really great and we were moving forward with, and other things we were either revisiting or we've had some kind of struggles with internally as we move forward. Next slide, Chris. Okay, so focusing on the level sheet, we took a couple of things out of the level sheet that were very important to us as a very small organization. So the plan and prioritize is something that we talked about at the beginning, that we talk about in the middle, and that we'll probably talk about right before we finish. It's very important to us for two main reasons. One is that we had very little money on hand to put forward for this project. We couldn't use our regular operating funds because a lot of those are grants that are specific for certain things, or our budget just doesn't have the space in it to really facilitate something on this project. And we didn't have any staff dedicated to it. So my job description doesn't include any of this work. And so we had to figure out how to do this project without really money or staff, which made it very challenging at the beginning and a little scary. Even though I have experience with digital material, it was still starting from scratch. And so setting our goals based on these reasons were really key for us. We really had to think about, why do we want to do this? Why is it worth it to do it for us? Because we're going to have to expend some time getting those things in place, even though we really didn't have the money or the staff. Next slide. So going from the plan and prioritize to actually digitizing, we were very excited to get into the digitizing stage. And this process really helped us. We looked at small achievable grants, meaning something we weren't asking for $10,000 and to paid staff. Our first grant was from the Wisconsin Council for Local History with the Wisconsin Historical Foundation, and they gave us $460. That was a matching grant so we could get hardware. So having hardware meant we could then establish relationships like with the UW-Madison High School, where we could have graduate students who are interested in archiving come in, and they got credit for the work, and we could have someone actually doing the evaluations and the recommendations. So they were very helpful initially when they came in, and we had 4 students from the high school that came in and did an initial evaluation and recommendations. And then we had a graduate student come in after they were finished who actually started the scanning process. The established community relationships for us, key. I mean, we really have met so many wonderful people, the community of practice, the iSchool, Fiore companies who donate space to us for the last 2 years for free to house our archive material so we can scan it. So these types of things really enabled us to be able to kind of move forward with our projects. And they were definitely key where we could start scanning material. Next slide. So we did face some challenges. We are facing challenges. I'm sure that happens with every organization, big and small. Changing staff. We've had 7 people now who've worked in our archives. And even though we have recommendation sheets on how to name things, we have metadata sheets and a description of what that category means, we still have had to go back and fix some of that. So that's definitely been a challenge as we've changed the people who've come in and out of the project. We really didn't know what was in here. So prioritizing it, we were relying on the iSchool students who did the evaluation to really tell us what it was. And so now we know better. We've gone through some of it. We've scanned a lot of it and we know. So some of these challenges that we face have been tricky, but I think we've been able to move forward slowly with it. The project timeline's another one. We thought we'd be finished in 1.5 years. We're on 2 years now, and we maybe have another year or 2, depending on if we can get another grant for it. And that just happens. We're kind of rolling with the project. Next slide. Oh, I think there's one before that. Yes. So project outlook, we're positive that this project is really in a good place. We were able to hire an archives assistant with the second grant that we got, and over half done. And hopefully we expect to load some of these documents in January 2022 so that they're accessible to the public, accessible to us. And again, we just wanted to emphasize that these levels are dynamic for small organizations like ours. It's very hard to hold structure. It's very hard to have a plan and stick to that plan. We needed to be able to say, well, now we don't have a space anymore. We need to pivot and figure out where we're going to do this. Do we find a co-working space? Can someone donate space? Is someone going to do it in their home? Those types of things have been really tricky. But I think also being part of this digital readiness community practice has been great because we've talked with other organizations who've gone through the same thing. We've been able to get advice and share advice and really create these relationships that have helped us sustain the project, which has been great. And next slide. And with that, we just wanted to show one more time kind of where we are and how, we've had ups and downs with this project, but we've definitely been able to move forward. And one of the things that's really helped us is looking at these levels, is being part of the community of practice, understanding that, we might be bronze here, we might be gold here. Does that mean we have to put a little more effort into this area? So this type of group and this community, I think, has been really helpful for us in getting our project kind of off the ground and going and hopefully finished in the next year or 2. And with that, I think I'm going to pass it to Dustin.
Thanks, Jennifer. So I'm Dustin Mack. I'm the chief curator for the History Museum at the Castle here in Appleton, Wisconsin, which means that I get to do a little bit of everything in my job. So if we can go to the next slide. So we have 4 full-time professional museum employees at the museum. We have a number of part-time staff that work here. Our budget is annually about $325,000, and we serve an average of 40,000 people every year. about half of those people each year come from beyond 100 miles of our area, which means that we're getting people from out of state, from Minneapolis, Chicago, all over the place that are visiting our museum. So that makes us slightly different from your average small museum. In 2018, we won the National Medal for Museum and Library Service. We take a lot of pride in being engaged in our community and telling stories that are sometimes difficult to tell, but are pointing towards the truth. And we see that as a way of building continuity and moving forward together. And we're just really proud that we were recognized for that on the national level. And that's something that we always continue to do. So our mission broadly then is to inspire people to discover the history of the Fox Valley, which is where Appleton is located. And we do that through exhibitions, education, and collections. And as the chief curator, all three of those aspects fall to me. So while today we're talking about collections, it's not the only thing that I'm focused on, which makes our experience here kind of beneficial to other organizations. Kristen, could you switch to the next slide? So the History Museum at the Castle is also an affiliate of the Wisconsin Historical Society. And in 2019, we became a regional partner for a community archiving workshop, or a CAW. And that was through a grant through IMLS, which is focused on identifying collections and then preserving specifically audio-visual collections and preparing those for digitization. And so the History Museum fell into kind of this sweet spot as a test subject. So we are on the larger end in Wisconsin, but we were on the smaller end nationally to be a CAW participant. So people on either side can learn from our experiences. So with that, then we picked a project that we thought would be relatable to smaller organizations and kind of drive home to a national audience what the challenges that we deal with as a small organization. So we have about 1,000 square foot archive, and it had a number of audio cassette tapes in it. And some of them we knew what they were, some of them they didn't. But we honed in on one particular collection that was 90 oral history interviews that were done between 1979 and 1980. And there was a really rough kind of handwritten sheet that was semi-documenting what was in this collection, but we weren't 100% sure if that was accurate or what that actually meant. So in terms of the digital readiness levels, then we were definitely bronze star level on these things. So for planning and prioritizing, we knew that we wanted to make this digital work fit with our mission. We knew that it did. And we kind of knew the policies that we wanted to adopt, but we hadn't moved into the silver category yet. The same was true of digitization, and then really with describing what this project was going to be and gaining intellectual control over it. We were bronze stars down the list. So that was a little bit discouraging, but it was also eye-opening in that there was a roadmap going forward. We're used to doing digital projects that related to photographs, but we hadn't branched into audio visual collections yet. So this was going to be a good test for us. So as part of the CAW, what we were trying to do was develop very basic instructions for other organizations to follow so that they could quickly identify what was in their collection, what it meant, what items might be at risk, and what needed to be prioritized for digitization. And then we developed a template in a spreadsheet where these volunteers, generally volunteers from these different or smaller organizations, could sit down and input that information so that would be readily accessible. And the thing that we kept coming back to was simplicity in the directions, and this idea that oftentimes it is volunteers, as Jennifer said, and there's a high turnover level with that. And so to get those instructions to be simple and repeatable by various people who would come into that process, that was one focus. The other was time. We wanted these directions to be simple so that people could do it for short bursts of time, whether it was a half hour or an hour that they could come in and volunteer. We wanted them to feel like they were making progress and could jump into this project without dedicating an entire day or a week to the process. And the other thing was the idea of the budget. Small organizations are always contending with how much money do I have and how much money can I spend? Because invariably, if you're spending money on digitization, that means you're not spending money on something else. And so weighing all of those criteria were something that we were really thoughtful about as we were doing this project. So I picked my favorite volunteer. Her name is Jan Cron, pictured there. And I came to her with this set of instructions that we had developed through the CAW. I presented her the digital readiness levels from Recollection, Wisconsin, and a spreadsheet. And I said, here are the 90 tapes that we're going to look at. And I want you to be the test subject to see if we can follow these instructions and input the information onto the spreadsheet. Now, Jan had an unfair advantage because in her career, she was a professional archivist for a corporation here in Appleton. So she is smarter than the average volunteer that we would have come through the museum, but that also gives her good insights into where the directions might fall short and an understanding of how to work with these volunteers. So Jan set to work doing this inventory, and I'm extremely grateful for her that she tackled that project, because now as a result, we know what the contents are. We have intellectual control over those oral histories, and that they're now accessible on this spreadsheet. It's not accessible to the public yet, but it is now something that the staff and our volunteers can easily access and use. And the entire collection is now safely stored and it's ready for digitization. We haven't been able to take that next step yet, but we are ready to advance onto that level. And I think more importantly, we proved that the basic instructions in the template worked as how-to resources for non-professionals. I cannot underscore that enough, that most of the people who are doing this work, particularly here in Wisconsin, are not trained in digitization. So to break the instructions down into a format that they can follow was extremely valuable. And with the threat of COVID-19 and kind of the uncertainty of what is going to happen to a lot of these organizations, just getting a handle on their collections is so important. And in the event that they should have to fold, that those collections just aren't lost into somebody's basement or an attic or what have you, that we can quickly assess what they have and create what its value is. So as a test subject, I can say it was a success. I'm very happy that we were able to be a guinea pig in that way. And we gained a lot of tools that I will apply going forward. And I know now kind of how to use the digital readiness levels and what to expect in creating projects and working with volunteers in the future.
So thanks so much to Jennifer and to Dustin for their work and their contributions to the digital readiness community of practice. To finish up, I want to emphasize our two main takeaways here. Local history practitioners are doing important work that we want to support, which is really important to give in accessible, non-overwhelming, doable ways. Their projects are much more successful and sustainable when done within a supportive community context, which we've worked over this past year to build and enhance. Thanks so much for watching today, and we look forward to taking your questions.